Good morning and welcome to PrideConHIP, a virtual space for conversations about the needs of the LGBTIQ+ community with an international and intersectional perspective. I am Paola Fragrino, manager of the Gender Equity Program of Hispanics in Philanthropy, and I am very happy that you are connected with us in this virtual space for reflection. To begin, I want to make a language justice announcement. Spanish interpretation is provided on this call. If you wish to hear the Spanish interpretation, please select the globe icon on your computer on the More or three dots icon on your tablet or smartphone. Select language interpretation and choose Spanish in the pop-up. Buenos días y bienvenidos a PrideConHIP. Es un espacio virtual de conversaciones sobre las necesidades de la comunidad LGBTIQA+, con una perspectiva interseccional e internacional. Soy Paola Feregrino y colaboro con Hispanics in Philanthropy. Estoy muy contenta de que estén conectados en este espacio de diálogo y reflexión. Y para comenzar, quiero hacer un anuncio de justicia del lenguaje. Tenemos interpretación en español. Si desean escuchar la interpretación en español, por favor seleccionar el icono del globo de la computadora en donde dice More o los tres puntitos en su tableta o teléfono inteligente. Seleccione interpretación de idiomas y después español del menú que aparece. From Hispanics in Philanthropy, we take the opportunity to celebrate Pride 2021 by bringing together activists and philanthropists that support Latino LGBTQ+ communities across the United States, Mexico, Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond. The roundtable conversation taking place on HIP's platform can echo the efforts to support Pride events, celebrations of our partners in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. We are so excited to present today the first table that we have called Funding LGBTQ+ Issues Without Being an LGBTQ+ Funder. Our main objective is to reflect on the state of the funding of LGBTQ+ activists in Latin communities and discuss ways to strengthen the social movements via transnational and intersectional lens. We want to thank very much our allies from Astraea Foundation for Justice, who do an extraordinary job raising and distributing funds to programs and initiatives led by and for diverse constituencies, prioritizing groups led by lesbians and queer women, trans and gender non-conforming people, intersex people, and people of color. I have the pleasure of introducing you to Lariza Romero, who is a Mexican queer feminist and program officer of the Latin America and the Caribbean and of Astraea Foundation. Thank you so much, Lariza, to be here and create with us this space. Thank you also to all our amazing speakers who will share important reflection and their experience with us. And that's it. I pass the word to Lariza. Thank you very much to all to be here with us and welcome.
Wow, thank you so much for that introduction, Paola. I also want to start by thanking Hispanics in Philanthropy for the openness to collaborate with Astraea Foundation in the creation of these spaces of open dialogue between those of us who work in the philanthropy sector and the brilliant LGBTIQ, Latinx, and Caribbean activists. So thank you so much, Paola, Jen, Lauren, Jero, Inaru, and everyone else that is in HIP and is working behind the scenes, making this possible. So thank you so much. And I want to thank the brilliant panelists that will join in a few seconds for your wisdom, experiences, and everything, reflections that you want to share with us regarding how to make this support of the LGBTIQ movements in a more intersectional and transnational way. So thank you so much for that. I'm really looking forward to sharing the space and learning from each other. To the audience, thank you so much for investing your time this next hour. Please write your questions in the chat below so we can have one moment at the end, more or less 10 minutes, to have a more open conversation with you. And I want to start by sharing a little bit about the context. We are in a very particular moment with right-wing governments in different countries in the region that are willing to advance LGBTIQ rights at the expense of pink washing their neoliberal and extractivist agendas. And that which are actually based on the labor exploitation and forced migration of the very same LGBTIQ people. So with that context in mind, I want to invite everyone in this space to reflect on how can we support social movements that have this political clarity and are committed to not only changing the system, but creating new systems, creating a new reconfiguration of healthy relationships that can be based in equality and diversity. A system or a home or whatever you want to call it that can be grateful to our ancestors, to the 7 generations before us, but can be also accountable to our descendants, to our the 7 generations to come. And with that in mind, we are just one dot. We are just one generation of a bigger picture. And how can we look beyond our particular scope of work and whatever that is, if it's LGBTI rights or gender justice or climate justice or whatever it is, and focus on how to improve the conditions for all. So with that, I would love if our panelists can introduce themselves. And I have a question I would love everyone to answer. If you can share, and I'm going to shift now to Spanish because I want Bianca to start. Bianca querida, me encantaría que puedas, por favor, brevemente presentarte y contestar a la pregunta. ¿Qué te trae a hacer este trabajo como persona LGBTIQ?
Hola, buenos días a todos, todas y todes. Es un placer para mí esta mañana estar acá compartiendo pues estos debates. Yo creo que ese trabajo que realizamos todos los activistas LGTB es precisamente para fundamentar el respeto, precisamente también fundamentar la igualdad y la equidad para las personas LGTB, más allá de trabajar otros componentes, precisamente es generar ese ambiente de igualdad social, de respeto y sobre todo de inclusión. Sabemos que los colectivos LGTB por años han pasado en esa invisibilidad y hago esa reflexión en esta fecha del 28 de junio, que precisamente no es una fecha de celebración, es una fecha de conmemoración, precisamente porque damos ese paso principalmente a esa visibilidad que por años se nos violentaba, se nos agredía, y fueron precisamente mujeres trans las que rompieron ese silencio y posicionaron esa visibilidad del colectivo LGTB. Y sobre todo posicionar que las que mayor enfrentaban esa violencia eran las mujeres trans racializadas, que a lo largo y extenso, por ejemplo, del mundo se habla del orgullo gay, del orgullo blanco, y nos olvidamos también precisamente de esas otras realidades como lo son las personas LGTB racializadas, las personas LGTB migrantes que enfrentan todos estos múltiples desafíos. Yo creo que eh, los y les defensores LGTB estamos precisamente alzando la voz, empoderando aún más las comunidades, tratando de ser el reflejo de estas realidades que muchas lastimosamente ya no pueden denunciar. Y para nosotros, eh, llevar esa bandera, esa voz, no significa llevar la victimización de las personas LGTB, sino ese empoderamiento que hemos tenido en los últimos años y sobre todo esa articulación para posicionar nuestras demandas, posicionar nuestras realidades, sobre todo felicitarles precisamente a HIP y a Astraea por posicionar las voces de las mujeres trans, de las personas LGTB, porque al final somos nosotras mismas las que debemos visibilizar nuestras afectaciones y no terceras personas que puedan vertir comentarios. Es muy bueno estos espacios precisamente para poner y posicionar esas demandas, que está bien el trabajo que se realiza en conjunto con la sociedad civil, pero más allá de fortalecer la sociedad civil, es también saber cuál es el impacto que deja nuestro trabajo en esa sociedad, si realmente está fortalecida, si realmente está empoderada, porque de nada sirve proveer servicios si no se genera autonomía. Y esa autonomía ahora las personas LGTB y ahora las personas trans estamos trabajando en ello, y por eso es que ahora estamos más que nunca más fuertes y resilientes en estos contextos.
Bianca, querida, entraste de lleno con el tema y amo todas las reflexiones que nos compartes. Muchísimas gracias por compartir de manera tan asertiva. Me gustaría que puedas rápidamente presentarte y decirme todas las cosas maravillosas que yo sé de ti, pero prefiero que tú las digas en primera persona, y dejamos el espacio para que también los demás panelistas se presenten rápidamente.
Bueno, ah, muchas personas me conocen, algo atrás, no, pues soy Bianca Rodríguez. Actualmente soy la directora ejecutiva y presidenta de la asociación Concabis Trans, una organización que ha trabajado por velar y promover el cumplimiento de los derechos de las personas LGTB, sobre todo para las personas trans que se han visto precisamente afectadas en sus derechos. Nuestro trabajo se centra precisamente en empoderar y generar esa autonomía para las personas LGTB en contextos de violencia, en contextos de discriminación, en contextos de exclusión, ya que El Salvador es uno de los países más violentos para las personas LGTB, con una tasa alta de homicidios basadas en la orientación sexual o la identidad de género. Un país donde prácticamente no existen políticas afirmativas que garanticen y que promuevan nuestros derechos, y es por eso que también la organización se ha centrado en fortalecer el trabajo territorial desde las bases para generar esa prevención, respuesta ante situaciones de violencia. Trabajamos con personas LGTB que se ven obligadas a huir de sus hogares, que no tienen esa respuesta precisamente por parte de las instituciones del Estado, y tienen que huir dentro del país, y posteriormente a esos ciclos de violencia y a ese desplazamiento que se genera de manera interna, acompañamos a personas LGTB a solicitar la protección internacional basada en un enfoque de respeto a sus derechos y sobre todo a esa dignidad que las personas refugiadas o migrantes debe de trabajarse. Sin duda creo que también es un camino muy largo, pues es un poco de nuestro trabajo, y agradecerles nuevamente por esto.
Muchas gracias, Bianca. Les voy a pedir a los demás panelistas que si pueden, por favor, ser un poquito más cortos, cortes con sus presentaciones. Está muy bien. Estamos rompiendo con la supremacía blanca de las cosas tienen que ser así. No, estamos en una mesa redonda. Entonces, Ezra, por favor, preséntate.
Hi all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Ezra Nippon. I'm with Global Philanthropy Project. I'm based in Philadelphia in the US. And my role at GPP is that I'm the Senior Program Officer for Knowledge and Learning. So my role today is I'll be talking about some of our research. But thanks for having me. Oh, and what attracts me to this work. I appreciate living in the world that LGBTI people have made with very scarce resources. And I want to live in the world that LGBTI people would make if we had anything approximating funding equity to LGBTI funding. So, you know, love of queer people, LGBTI people, you know, close to me and far away is what brings me here.
Thank you so much, Ezra. Marco, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. My name is Marco Antonio Quiroga. I use he, him, él pronouns. I identify as queer and Latinx. I think my video, maybe there's a lag or I just paused. But just as an introduction, I just wanted to start off by saying I never imagined myself in philanthropy. So I never imagined myself in this work to begin with. As some background, my family immigrated from Lima, Peru when I was 2 years old. My mother fled and escaped a domestically violent marriage and took me and my siblings on a bus down to Orlando, Florida. And that's when my family became undocumented and I was 3 years old. We experienced homelessness as a family here in Orlando. I lost my younger brother to deportation. I reached the point where I lost all hope of my life here in the US and went through deep depressions and was on the brink of self-deporting. Those were my realities. And it was other undocumented young Latina women and undocuqueer organizers in Florida that introduced me to the movement. And that's where I found my voice and my power. I am here today because my community invested in my leadership, encouraged me every step of the way to live in my full authentic self as a queer, undocumented person of color. And I came into this work when on June 12, 2016, the Pulse nightclub shooting took place here in my hometown of Orlando, which we just observed the 5-year mark remembrance of. The Pulse shooting was very personal to me. The shooting targeted young, queer, Latinx folks, undocumented immigrants, and other people of color. Pulse was actually the place that I built a chosen family when I was experiencing homelessness as a teen when I came out as queer. And I had numerous friends that were hospitalized and directly impacted. And so there was a coalition of private foundations that wanted to support the recovery, and they tapped me to lead a local community needs assessment. And that needs assessment identified a need for a vehicle for long-term change, and Contigo Fund was born out of that. And so that's where my journey in philanthropy started. I serve as the founding executive director for Contigo. I believe at that time I was the the first and only out undocuqueer person in philanthropy. At least that's what I was told by, at least in LGBTQ philanthropy, which is something I was told by funders for LGBTQ issues. That was 5 years ago. And I'm happy to say I'm not the only one anymore, though there are still only a handful of people that I could probably list who are part of the community who have that lived experience. And who work in our sector. And so I would just say that the philanthropic sector wasn't built for people like me to be in. I was not identified through a headhunter firm. I did not go through an extensive or official interview process and selection process. I was just the right person to do the work. And one thing I want to emphasize is that people like me, people who have an undocumented lived experience, who are from the Latinx community, particularly those living at the intersection of marginalized identities with deep roots in community and movements, are also the right people to do this work. And so we should definitely center and follow their leadership whenever possible. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Marco, for those powerful words. I echo everything you said. And Paul, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, happy to. I will keep it very brief. Here, Paul Jensen from Outright Action International. I have a very fancy job title, but I lead the programs team within Outright Action International. And pronouns are he, him. Feliz también para hablar en español. A veces voy a hacerlo. But also not to drive the translation people wild, I will stick to English. What drew me to philanthropy and this job? Actually, I'm a trained cook. Like, it's how life turns and twists. At one point, someone approached me like, hey, we're in a deep mess. Can you come to the job and help us out? And that's how it started 22 years ago. So, and I loved it. And I bring brain, body, and passion to the work in a very humble way, with all the privileges and good and bad things that are part of me as a person. I'm very happy to be part of Outright Action International for the last 4 years. One of the big things that we did is establish a COVID emergency fund for LGBTIQ communities, giving as well many grants to Latin America and Latin American groups, because we know that COVID really hit hard our communities on the continent, and especially those that were already suffering of multiple vulnerabilities, intersecting vulnerabilities. But I think Lariza will talk about that more, so let me stop there.
Thank you so much. So welcome, all of you. I'm so excited. And you already started sharing so much wisdom, so thank you so much for it. And I'm going to ask the first question to Ezra. If you could please share with us, what is the LGBTIQ funding context globally, but more specifically for Latin and Caribbean communities, both in the region, but also in the US, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry, there's a loud truck. I'm going to mute myself just for 1 second. That's showbiz. Okay, so thank you so much. And I think we're going to also show some slides. So I'll just get started and we'll get the slides up. Thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to thank you all again for the opportunity to present this data about LGBTI global funding trends in the context of such a powerful and exciting conversation. I'll be presenting materials from the 2017-2018 Global Resources Report, which is developed by Global Philanthropy Project in collaboration with funders for LGBTQ issues. And you can find the full report with much more detail online at globalresourcesreport.org. And I'm going to post it here and it'll show up in your Zoom too. So I want to take this moment to quickly make a pitch to make sure for any foundations that are in the room that your 2019 and 2020 LGBTI grants are counted. So you can go to submit.globalresourcesreport.org to share your grants for the 4th cycle of this biennial report I'm about to talk about more, which provides philanthropy, governments, multilateral agencies, corporate foundations, and civil society with the most detailed and accurate understanding of the global funding landscape on LGBTI issues. And here's that link. Global funding trends and the gaps they indicate are deeply political, as I'm sure everyone here can imagine and knows deeply. With this report, we present the information without much commentary, understanding that our role is really to provide materials that enable advocates, grant makers, and policymakers to use this information to make the case and to develop solutions for remediation of the funding inequities that the data point to. So on the next slide, the overall picture is that the 2017-18 Global Resources Report documented $560 million US in LGBTI funding across the 2 years documented. This is good news. It represents an increase of 57 million or 11% from the previous report for 2015 and 16. The number also includes grants data from 815 funders, 15 of which are government and multilateral organizations, and almost 20,000 grants around the world. That's also an increase of 300 grant makers reporting from around the world. And in this report, it documents an increase of 54% in the number of grants. So the last report really showed, the work of trying to mobilize more resources for LGBTI communities is working. We're moving towards the increased funding that we all are advocating for. And in the next slide, the less pretty picture is that while $560 million is a big number, and the increase over time is something to celebrate, compared to overall foundation funding and government funding, LGBTI communities are receiving close to nothing. We received less than 31 cents out of every $100 compared to overall global foundation funding. And compared to overall government development funding, LGBTI communities around the world received just 4 cents out of every $100. And this slide, I feel like it's often hard to process because my brain wants to think it's 31 cents and 4 cents out of every dollar, but it really is out of every $100. So 560 million is big, but in the scale of global funding, LGBTI communities are barely on the map. So on the next slide, this report looks at data for 7 world regions. And here you see that funding to the region of the US and Canada majorly outsizes the funding to any other world region. That includes close to $300 million, of which only 300,000 was focused on Canada. So, 299.7 million of this is really funding to the US. Funding to Latin America and the Caribbean is the 3rd largest region, receiving about $38 million. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail in this presentation. And just again, to remind us all that this is for 2 years. So in the next slide, this slide shows how LGBTI funding in the region has increased over time, showing a significant increase in 2017 and 18. That increase is due in large part to just a few major grants that were awarded from one embassy to a large intermediary organization and a multilateral agency for work in the region. So they may represent a trend, but that depends on what the next, we'll be able to talk to see more about whether this sharp increase represents a trend in the next coming years. As you'll see in the chart at the right, also that embassy funding also outsized similar funding in all other regions. So you can read more about embassy funding, intermediary funding flows, or like the regranting flow of resources in recent briefs called the Diving Deeper series that GPP has put out, and I'm going to give you that link as well. So a reminder for those new to this report, these funds awarded for regranting are not included in these charts, as is indicated by a little key that says R negative. And this report tracks the full amount of multi-year grants in the year awarded. So spikes in funding, such as the increase that is shown here, may also relate to large multi-year grants that will be expanded over time. So thank you. And going on to the next slide. The report also includes a sub-regional breakout, which indicated that in 2017 and 18, South America was the sub-region receiving the largest amount of funding, and the Caribbean received the lowest amount in this world region. And the report also shows funding by specific country. The amount for each country is listed in the report. In this report, we also document funding by populations within the LGBTI umbrella, by issue area, and more. And there's a lot more to dig into. So I want to encourage people to really dig into the full report for more resource. This is developed as guidance and as a tool for funders who don't fund in the LGBTI world, or who do already but want information about, okay, so where are the gaps, where can funding be most strategic? And the next slide, with appreciation to funders for LGBTQ issues and HIP, who have developed this really informative infographic. It looks at data about funding for the LGBTQ Latinx communities in the US. And here's a link that you can share for people who want to download the full resource. So here, this infographic shows that funding has gradually increased between 2014 and 2018, with a dramatic spike in 2016 in response to the Pulse nightclub massacre. And I know Marco Antonio has spoken to that, and will probably speak more to that in this panel, and the philanthropic response that was developed and that really shows up on this slide. So the infographic, if you want to go to the next slide, thank you, also shows top funders and notes that a small group of grant makers make up the majority of LGBTQ Latinx funding in the US. And finally, on the next slide, the infographic from Funders for LGBTQ Issues and HIP shares recommendations, which I'm sure will probably come up for panelists in this session, to provide support for LGBTQ Latinx-led organizations and grassroots groups, to provide capacity building and leadership development for LGBTQ Latinx leaders, to provide support for LGBTQ organizations and Latinx organizations that have intersectional lenses, and to ask current grantees about how they are serving vulnerable communities at the intersection of multiple identities, including LGBTQ Latinx communities. So with my final slide, I thank you to the tech team for this support. Just thank you all for the opportunity to share this data and to encourage people to dig in and learn more. And a final pitch to make sure that your grants are counted in the next round of this report. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for sharing this data that gives us the context of how the situation is in terms of the funding to the movement and the gaps that we have in the different countries in the region and also in the US. So thank you so much, Ezra, for that. Marco, I have a very long question for you. This month, as you already said, we observed the 5-year mark of the horrific Pulse nightclub massacre, which was then the largest single incident of mass gun violence in modern US history, with 49 lives taken and hundreds more left with wounds, seen and unseen. The tragedy targeted LGBTQI Latinx young people in Orlando. And in your work with Contigo Fund, could you share what you learned, what has improved from that moment, and what needs to change for LGBTQ Latinx communities and other communities of color, particularly in the US South?
Thank you so much for that context. So just to give a little bit of a shout out to Funders for LGBTQ Issues, who created the infographic along with HIP, and add some context around the big spike that folks saw in 2017 reporting around funding for LGBTQ Latinx communities in response to Pulse. The response to Pulse in terms of LGBTQ philanthropy, it was the largest single campaign that in LGBTQ philanthropy history. There was over $30 million raised through the One Orlando Fund. And the One Orlando Fund was specific towards supporting the survivors. The over 300 individuals are physically present in the nightclub, and the 49 families of the individuals who are taken from us. And so it's very specific to a group of individuals, and it was time limited. And so for a lot of people here in the US who have been following the news, that money has, in terms of direct financial assistance to the survivors and families, has almost entirely dried up 5 years later. And the broader philanthropic response towards supporting the organizations on the ground who have been doing the long time work of supporting the LGBTQ communities of color that were distinctly impacted by the tragedy has all but dried up as well. And so if you saw in the news just most recently, Florida's governor just vetoed in the annual budget here for the state ongoing care and support, mental health support for the survivors and families. And so that's, in terms of like the need, I just wanted to emphasize the need is great and it's growing. And one thing that I want to also emphasize is that we should never forget what happened to our community at Pulse. Even though now we're seeing more instances of mass gun violence across the US, sometimes 3-4 times a week now that we're seeing mass gun violence incidences, we can't become complacent to them. And we need to be responsive to the marginalized communities that it most likely impacts, in particular queer and trans communities, people living in poverty, communities of color, and particularly communities of color living in the South. And so I wanted to share really quickly an op-ed that was I co-wrote with the former president of Funders for LGBTQ Issues around our response to Pulse. It's lessons that we learned 5 years later. I shared it in the chat just now. And if there's one thing that I could lift up from the tragedy, it's the importance of being community-driven and movement-led. This is a question that everyone across every sector should ask themselves, HIP included. So this is a call-in because I want to emphasize that LGBTQ plus friendly social media posts during Pride Month is not enough. And having these types of conversations that only center queer and trans Latinx communities during June as we observe Pride Month or as we honor the lives taken at Pulse is not enough. Our communities deserve more, and everyone has a responsibility to do some internal reflection. How are you building on the decision-making power of LGBTQ Latinx communities at your organization? How are you moving dollars to support folks living at those intersections? It is time for all of us to do that inequity assessment in terms of our work, in terms of making sure that we're reaching these individuals who are most pushed to the margins. Being movement-led to me means centering those who are most directly impacted: LGBTQ, undocumented people, criminalized and formerly detained people, refugees, Afro-Latinx, Black, and especially trans folks. Being led by and for, building on their leadership and decision-making power, believing that those closest to the challenges we are seeking to address are closest to the solutions we need. And I'm not just talking about the leaders at the very top, not the leaders with the impressive resumes, not the leaders with the great speaking skills, or even those with a good grasp on English for those here in the US. They are often the unsung heroes on the front lines who often go unrecognized, unpaid, and undervalued. They are the ones who have fallen through the cracks of the nonprofit sector and their safety nets. These are the people we are seeking to reach. It's these folks who represent the issues we are trying to address. We have to believe and trust that those with lived experience and deep roots in communities know what's best for their own communities. And I want to use Contigo as an example. At the time of the Pulse tragedy in 2016, LGBTQ communities in Orlando were deeply and historically under-resourced. There were 0 nonprofits or grassroots groups that were led by and for LGBTQ people of color. There were little to no community spaces for LGBTQ plus people of color outside of the nightclubs. And at the time, the Pulse shooting was was stated the largest incident of mass violence in US history, was primarily impacted Latinx monolingual Spanish speaking families. And there was not even one LGBTQ culturally competent Spanish speaking mental health counselor in all of Central Florida. Those are the realities we're living with here. Contigo launched as the first and only LGBTQ Latinx fund in the US, is 100% participatory, meaning we have a community board of 14 leaders that represent the full diversity of our LGBTQ community, is multiracial, over half are women, a quarter are trans women of color, and includes folks who are undocumented, migrant farm workers, and folks from rural communities. The original cohort of leaders from our community board were identified through the community needs assessment as folks with valuable lived experiences and deep roots in pulse affected and historically marginalized communities. None were nonprofit employees. None had any positive history engaging with nonprofits or connection to grassroots movement work. They were highly represented, but they were highly representative of those that were physically present at the nightclub on June 12th. Through their leadership over these past 5 years, Contigo has grown into the largest place-based grant maker, distinctly supporting LGBTQ communities of color in the US South, and the 5th largest funder of LGBTQ Latinx communities in the nation, according to Funders for LGBTQ Issues tracking report. There are now over 20 grassroots groups and community organizations led by and for LGBTQ leaders of color here that have emerged and have been cemented in our community since Pulse. And now here we are 5 years later after Pulse, and we are still the only LGBTQ Latinx fund in the nation. So I just want to point to the opportunity is there, and we can expand on it. And all this points to is the power that exists when you build on the leadership of those who are most impacted and trust those with lived experience with decision-making power and advance the values of intersectionality and collective liberation.
Thank you so much, Marco. I want to echo the different things you already mentioned, which is how to support not only LGBTIQ communities, but LGBTIQ-led communities and activists. I think that's very important, and we have to maintain it in the center of the conversation. And obviously, Latinx and Caribbean LGBTI activists are really making a change. There are so many needs that you already mentioned between you and Ezra, which we really need to pay attention. But I think what you have done, it's a great success of how the communities can organize themselves to change things for the better. And I just want to recognize that, because I think it's very, very important. And Paul, I know just because we have spoken before, you have great experiences with how the philanthropy sector has responded to the different needs. And I would love if you can share that fantastic initiative that took place in Outright and how beautiful and expansive has been. Please share your wisdom.
Thanks so much, Larissa. Happy to. I'll give you a little bit of the background when the COVID, we're talking about the global COVID emergency LGBTIQ fund that Outright established in March last year. When we started hearing from our Asian colleagues that something really horrible was coming our way. We were about to do trainings in the Philippines, and everything was being canceled. And restrictions were put in place by the Philippine government. And we saw like a steam truck, the pandemic going throughout the world, closing everything, putting people in confinement with all the restrictions that were there. What we heard from people on the ground, from the communities on the ground, is like, we're shut off from our income. We're shut out of our access to healthcare. We're shut off from all kinds of other things that we need in on a day-to-day basis. Can you help? And we were like, what should we do? Like, this is what's happening. So for us, the only answer was like, we need to get money to the communities on the ground. And so on a Thursday afternoon, it was raining in Spain. Yeah, can you imagine? Because I'm based in Spain. I was like, okay, we designed a fund and let's make it happen. Let's see how far we can get. We need to fundraise for it. Our estimation was that we would have like $100,000 to give out in grants. So about 10 grants. Well, the story is known. Like, we did a research immediately afterward, a global research called Vulnerabilities Amplified, the story of LGBTI communities in COVID time pandemics. We started fundraising, and we, by now, as of today, we disbursed $1.6 million to 177 groups around the globe. Around like 35% of those are in Latin America. So what we saw from the applications in Latin America is first the diversity of the community. I have to stress that because often we are packed down to the national organization that everybody knows. And through the application in this fund, we saw so many beautiful initiatives, like a school for trans children and adolescents, to a tiny community organization working on the border between Venezuela and Colombia to give support to LGBTIQ refugees from Venezuela. Well, I can give you many examples of that. The vulnerabilities that we saw is like what we always see. People were closed out of income. We see that many LGBTIQ people, and especially trans people, are working in the informal sector, and they couldn't get any income anymore. So for us, the most important thing was to get income to these groups to survive. Simple. To buy food, to buy medicines, to get COVID protection material. So that was really last year the big ask that we saw. And actually, this year, when we repeated the call, it was the same all over again. Like, we thought by now that we would have learned, or the governments would have learned, to serve the population, at least with COVID prevention materials and whatever. We see that LGBTIQ people are being left out. And the marginalization and vulnerability is amplified by all the existing inequalities that we all know: race, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender expression and identity, you name them. Like, if I look at applications now, it's so really tragic to see that there's many from like Afro communities in Latin America saying, no one cares about us, like we're not there. From refugee communities that are scattered around the continent and the region saying, we really need help because the government doesn't do anything for us. Like, we're depending on NGOs and community organizations to support us. So it's all these kinds of things that for us really led to double our effort to invest in Latin America and the Caribbean, to give like a drop in that huge ocean of needs that we see. Like, to give you the example, we have 18 million of requests out there, 18 million. We, through our fantastic fundraising that we do, we can probably do 2 million. So there's still a gap of 16 million that needs to be filled. So I leave it there. Just give you the need and what we as Outbright do as a tiny drop in the ocean to support those vulnerable and marginalized communities throughout the continent. And just to close, Larissa, like, we know there's a lot of political turmoil on the continent. We know what the governments are doing. We know how inefficient and ineffective and horrible certain governments are. We see countries going into turmoil: Colombia, Peru, the Central American countries, Brazil, you name them. It's tragic. We have to be there. We need to work with the groups, registered and unregistered, trust communities to do the work and be flexible in our approaches to philanthropy and funding these groups. Amen. I leave it there.
Totally. I think we all were nodding like, yes, we need flexibility. Yes, we need to fund in a different way and to understand this money in a completely different way. I'm going to echo Edgar Villanueva with, we have to decolonize this wealth and give it back to the people that was actually coming from originally.
But Larissa, just to add 20 seconds, because you want to inform as well. Like, you see how we already like preconditions. Like I get groups asking me like, oh, but what are all the conditions and when do I need to report? And oh, how difficult are the reports? And I was like, don't worry, like you need to serve your community. I will deal with my accountants on my side. You worry about the community. So it says already about like the mindset, how people are focused and trained in that horrible system that we have. So let's try to break that with initiatives like this and start again. Sorry, Larissa, I was interrupting you, but I couldn't leave it.
No, me encanta que hayas hecho esta aclaración tan específica, porque es verdad. Y les quiero pedir a todas las personas y activistas brillantes LGBTIQ que realmente reflexionemos, o sea, yo, persona que estoy trabajando en la filantropía, mucho de mi trabajo es ser mediadora entre lo que les activistas en la región necesitan y están haciendo y lo que me piden como del otro lado, ¿no? Entonces, no, aquí es ¿qué necesitas? ¿No? Aquí es la pregunta es apoyar y tener rendición de cuentas con los movimientos sociales y no al revés. Creo que ese es un muy buen punto y muchas gracias, Paul, por mencionarlo. Bianca, querida, quiero preguntarte, por favor, ¿cuáles son las oportunidades que has observado en movimientos sociales, pero también en la filantropía, para ser más interseccionales, para realmente tener un foco más allá de, ya lo han estado mencionando las demás personas, pero me gustaría también saber qué oportunidades estás viendo.
Bueno, primero partamos de ese concepto de la interseccionalidad. Y esto para mí precisamente es una herramienta de análisis para también en el trabajo de la abogacía, en la elaboración de políticas públicas, que aborden precisamente esas múltiples dimensiones de la discriminación, de la violencia, sobre todo de que nos apoye a entender de manera más concreta y de manera conjunta las diversas afectaciones y sobre todo las diferentes identidades que influyen en el acceso o que las personas LGTB puedan tener acceso a esos derechos y a más oportunidades. En lo particular también partir desde esta perspectiva no es no es suficiente, mejor dicho, visibilizar las relaciones de dominación en función del género, olvidando olvidando cómo este sistema precisamente de poder se articula o se co-construye, por así decirlo, con otros. Por ejemplo, la interseccionalidad se puede ver desde la raza, desde la clase social, desde la sexualidad, entre otros. Y esto implica reforzar esas lógicas de cómo la opresión y cómo la exclusión se siguen fortaleciendo y cómo cómo el trabajo de esta interseccionalidad puede hacer a los movimientos un poco más resilientes. Yo partiría desde ese punto para poder analizar esas oportunidades, porque al final, por ejemplo, vemos que el movimiento feminista es uno de los principales movimientos que ha fomentado este enfoque de la interseccionalidad, pero prácticamente también hay otras vertientes dentro del movimiento feminista que no se apegan precisamente a esa interseccionalidad. Por ejemplo, los colectivos TER, que son parte también del movimiento feminista, pero que son, por ejemplo, trans excluyentes. Sí, definitivamente yo creo que una oportunidad que debemos tomar todos desde la sociedad civil, desde las organizaciones internacionales, desde los cooperantes, es fortalecer ese trabajo colaborativo y sobre todo cómo los movimientos sociales pueden generar esa interseccionalidad y cómo fortalecer precisamente a través de esa interseccionalidad las luchas, las voces y la representatividad. porque al final no vamos a, cuando hablamos de enfoque de igualdad de género, no solo vamos a referirnos a mujeres, a niñas, a niños, adolescentes, a personas con discapacidad, a personas LGTB, sino que nos referimos a esa interseccionalidad de que, por ejemplo, yo como persona LGTB me veo afectada, por ejemplo, si mi país no regula ese derecho al agua, por ejemplo. Esa interseccionalidad no me excluye precisamente de otros derechos y fundamentar precisamente de que el que a mí se me nieguen los derechos como persona LGTB no implica de que yo tampoco puedo velar o ver cómo esa interseccionalidad también converge en mis realidades, porque yo he escuchado desde los propios movimientos LGTB decir, por ejemplo, yo estoy en contra del aborto, pero yo quiero que se reconozcan mis derechos, que yo pueda tener el derecho a una familia, que yo pueda tener el derecho a poderme casar, que yo pueda tener ese derecho a vivir una vida libre de violencia, pero prácticamente a veces se nos olvida esa interseccionalidad de que también dentro del propio colectivo LGTB, dentro del propio colectivo trans, existe esa capacidad, por ejemplo, de les compañeras trans de tener cuerpos gestantes y al llevar esos mensajes de decir, yo no apoyo aquella causa, yo no estoy de acuerdo con esta postura. Dentro de nosotros mismos como movimiento social nos vamos dividiendo y eso es lo que precisamente buscan las agendas de los políticos, desarticular la sociedad civil precisamente para fundamentar la desigualdad. Yo creo que también ese es trabajo de nosotros como defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos, de fortalecer dentro de nuestros movimientos sociales esa interseccionalidad de derechos, esa interseccionalidad de identidades, porque no podemos seguir operando desde la exclusión y de la desigualdad, porque al final estamos haciendo o estamos contradiciéndonos en lo que a veces prometemos, en lo que a veces está fundamentada nuestra lucha, porque al final hacemos lo contrario de lo que realmente es el deber ser.
Muchísimas gracias, Bianca. Solo quiero hacer resonar de, sí, esto va más allá, muchísimo más allá de solo igualdad. Tenemos que empezar a incorporar otros conceptos, porque ya no se trata solo de igualdad, se trata de diversidad, se trata de tener esta claridad acerca de involucrar y de tener rendición de cuentas con personas racializadas en toda la región y en todos los temas. Muchas gracias. Sé que hay algunas preguntas muy buenas que se hicieron. Vamos a darle seguimiento, no las vamos a dejar sin contestar. No nos da tiempo para contestarlas todas en este minuto que tenemos y no queremos abusar del tiempo de todas las personas porque tenemos otras cosas que hacer este día. Solo quiero cerrar con algunos llamados que se hicieron. Llamados, por ejemplo, a financiar organizaciones feministas transincluyentes, racializadas, latinex, caribeñas. También a hablar acerca de una política de control de armas en Estados Unidos que es urgente, ¿no? Creo que eso hay que ponerlo sobre la mesa y que estamos aquí para apoyar, o sea, somos parte de estos movimientos sociales en amplio, entonces, si ustedes son parte de una fundación, de un fondo que no apoya específicamente cuestiones LGBTIQ, aquí estamos nosotros para ayudarles. O sea, podemos compartir, tenemos mapeos de organizaciones en las distintas temáticas, en las temáticas de defensa del territorio, de acceso al agua, de derecho a vivienda digna, de justicia económica, ¿no? Que es algo que se estuvo mencionando, que todos estuvieron mencionando en el panel. Entonces, solo quiero cerrar con la frase, solo el pueblo puede salvar al pueblo. Y cómo nos organizamos de otras maneras y pensamos los recursos de otra manera, de una manera mucho más autónoma, en donde los recursos tienen que ser de la comunidad para la comunidad esto, ¿no? De los movimientos a los movimientos. Voy a agradecer a todos, muchas gracias por toda la sabiduría que nos compartieron. Por favor, continuemos la conversación en otro momento. Me dará muchísimo gusto y voy a dejar que Paola comparta unos mensajes parroquiales. Pao, querida, ¿estás por ahí?
Estoy por aquí, pero me parece que no puedo abrir mi cámara. Ah, ya, aquí va, listo. Muchísimas gracias también a todas y todos. Gracias por ese extraordinario cierre. Tenemos muy poquitos minutitos nada más para compartirles que las actividades de Pride con HIV siguen. Esta tarde vamos a tener a las 7 de la tarde Central Time y 8 de la tarde Eastern Time a DJ Breast, que nos va a hacer un live en Instagram tocando música latina, música de hip hop, R&B, no se lo pierdan. Y mañana también tenemos otra mesa hablando de nuevos activismos y cómo darles visibilidad en los temas LGBT también. Entonces, muchas gracias por conectarse, no se lo pierdan, y todas las preguntas que nos estuvieron haciendo las vamos a estar contestando en nuestras redes sociales a través de Twitter. Gracias a todas por conectarse, a todos, a todes, a las y los panelistas por estas importantes reflexiones, y no se pierdan las siguientes actividades.